Hey everyone, welcome back to another video at Curious Cat Stories, where we read Reddit stories for your entertainment. Today I got two amazing stories from the r/pro revenge subreddit. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the videos that's to come. Alright, first story, titled, Stepdad Cheats on Mum, So We Get Revenge. Initials for clarity, me 24M, my mother 50F, my brother 23M, my sister 30F, sis is cheating stepdad 45M, Chris's stepdad, co-worker 25F, Betty the other woman 40F, Delara. This may be a long one, apologies in advance. I moved in with my mum after her marriage of 25 years with my bio dad had ended. He was a manipulative a-hole, but that's another story. Shortly after the divorce, my mum introduced me to her boyfriend at the time, Chris. Now, my mum worked as a correctional officer at the county jail. This boyfriend was a former inmate in for a DUI. That should have been the first red flag, but mum was grieving a long marriage and I didn't want to push the subject. Chris seemed to make her happy and that was enough for me. Me, bro and sis all moved in with mum and Chris and we seemed to get along okay. Chris and I bonded a bit over our love for video games and all seemed well. That was all until 2017. Due to Chris's prior DUI, he had to go in for regular probational checkups at the courthouse. One day he didn't return and we got a little worried. We then received a phone call from him in Texas. Turns out when he arrived at the courthouse that day, he was jumped by the FBI. His family from Texas was implicated on a number of gang and drug-related crimes, and due to a situation where he was in a vehicle during a drug handoff, he was on the hook as well. He ended up agreeing to testify against his family members in exchange for a shorter sentence and be allowed to put out of prison before the trial. My mum was distraught, and over the course of many phone calls over the year, they worked out their marriage plans when he returned. His store owner at DQ he worked at the time allowed him to come back to his store manager position. Soon after, the drinking started. Now obviously because of the DUI, Chris was clearly no stranger to drinking. He became to drink more and more to the point where he was consuming half a 24 pack of beer a day. Chris was a mean drunk. He regularly started fights when wasted. And while they never got physical, he wasn't exactly kind with his words. My mum enabled his behaviour for several years, saying the stress was getting to him from work and from the upcoming trial. Finally, after several years, my mum had enough. Chris came home extremely drunk one night, and my mum confronted him. She asked if he had been drinking, and when he didn't deny it, she kicked him out. He went to live with a friend temporarily. The next morning, Mum asked us to help him gather a few of his essentials so that he didn't have to re-enter the home until he was sober. While we were gathering his things, we heard a knock at the front door. We opened it to find Betty, one of Chris's co-workers and someone I went to high school with. She told my mum that she had something important to share. After sitting my mum down and telling her not to share where she got this information from, Betty told my mum that about how Chris was cheating on her with Delara, how he regularly had Delara perform sexual acts in and around the workplace, how Betty had caught them, and how Chris told her that if she ever told his mum, he'd fire her. He was the store manager. And finally, how Delara was pregnant. My mum was angry. After the initial shock wore off, she told us to round up all of Chris's things and dump it outside. We took everything of his out of the house and tossed it all in the alley behind our house. Chris had no reason or ability to return to the house. It was rented with only my mum on the paperwork, so no issues there. In the meantime, she called and confronted him. He confessed to the entire affair and was happy that Delara was pregnant because that meant he'd finally have a child of his own. Mum refused to have more kids. We three were a massive strain on her body. She likely wouldn't have survived anymore. He refused to apologize for any of his actions. My mum arranged for him to collect his items from the alley with a police officer present, and he left our lives. Now on to the revenge. Now my mum clearly wanted to dust her hands off with him and move on. She was already quite emotional from the whole ordeal and wanted nothing more from him. But sis, bro, and I had other ideas. First, we called his workplace DQ, operated as its own independent franchise, and the owner of this branch owned several branches in the area. He was also a good friend. We informed him of the sexual acts being performed on the premises, and he went down the process of getting Chris booted from his position and barred from any of the branches in the area. Funnily enough, Betty got the position after he left and now runs a tight and clean ship. Chris no longer had a job or place to live, so he went to live with Delara in a town about an hour away. We found out after he started working at another DQ in that town and informed the owner of that location of the situation. It took significantly longer due to there being no current indecent actions occurring there, but eventually he lost his job there too. Soon after, Chris began driving around our neighborhood, seemingly stalking my mum and our family, probably because of his jobless now. Now, due to the whole situation in Texas, he had never had his probation lifted from his DUI and thus still did not have a license. He never had to drive when he lived with us since work was local and we could drive him as needed. But here he was clearly driving around by himself when he shouldn't be. We contacted the police and informed them about Delara's vehicle on our property and that we believed Chris was driving it without a license. We told them to pull over the vehicle next time they see it, as it was probably a BC driving again. Sure enough, a few weeks later we were told that Chris indeed was pulled over and sent back to local jail for driving without a license and driving intoxicated. The police also did a search of the home he was staying at and found several guns at the premises. Since he was a felon, he was legally not allowed to have any weaponry on the premises, meaning there was more jail time to be tacked on. By the time his whole time had finished, it was just in time for him to be sent back to incarceration in Texas for his trial. Chris's son was born while Chris was in prison. Delara eventually realized what an absolute ass Chris was and cut ties with him while he was in prison. During his prison time, Chris started sending tons of letters to my mum, stating how sorry he was, pleading to take him back, and ranting about how it wasn't his fault. All in the same letter, mind you. Mum burnt every one of them. We moved on, moving out of state. Chris eventually got out of prison some years ago and now lives in Kansas, struggling and fighting child support, which Delara sued him for. Mum now has a new boyfriend who treats her right and cares about her a lot more than Chris ever did. Bro and sis moved on and out, and I still live with my mum, assisting her with her newly purchased home, and we've been renovating. Life's looking okay. I was still reminded of this by a chat with a co-worker about Cheetos and thought I would share it here for everyone else to enjoy. That's crazy. Honestly, that's a really good story. I'm glad we were able to read that. Alright, moving on to the next story. This is also from the r/pro revenge subreddit. Don't antagonize your lawyer while you're selling your company. Title's a bit dramatic. The revenge is tame compared to what I have read here as a lurker so far, but it is the most satisfying thing I have done so far, given that this happened outside the US where labor laws are at best guidelines. I left out several details. My apologies for the wording/format if this is unfamiliar to where you are. TLDR. Management threatens their lawyer. The lawyer proves why this is not a great idea. I was the in-house lawyer for a multinational company that sold software. I specifically joined this relatively lesser-known company to learn more about compliance. The company was listed on the stock exchange, meaning more compliance work. I highlighted this specifically as one of the reasons for my seeking out a change. I discovered it was filled with senior citizens, not an age thing. When I joined, basically a company full of old-timers who were there purely because they're close to the company owners. As part of the onboarding experience, I had to sit through seminars of how they change the industry and how they know XX. This meant I had 3 different bosses. One senior guy who was the fixer, I'll call him Senior Guy 1 for convenience, no one really knew what he did, but he got a cabin to himself. Another ex-senior management guy who got the gig from the owner to negotiate tech contracts, Senior Guy 2. I highlighted this because the ex-senior management guy asked me what EULA. Another was my reporting manager, to whom I was expected to work on a day-to-day basis, Senior Guy number 3. 1 month after joining, I was told that the company was going private through a sale to another entity. I was shocked, but I had loans to pay, so I continued. For some reason, I was senior enough for them to handle this independently. This meant I worked through nights to complete tasks that a law firm would ordinarily do. I worked on a definite agreement that was in use for the company to be sold. This will become important for later. By the 3rd month, I had decided that the role wasn't as advertised, and that I was essentially cheap labour for M&A. Buyers were from another city and planned to have their offices there. I was not keen on moving on. I read between the lines and started lining up interviews. Things went south quickly. Old-timers were unhappy that I was looking for a job, because that would mean they're answerable to the owners, or worse, have to do their work themselves. Due to harassment, which really solidified my resolve to leave. All my complaints about Senior Guy number 1, 2 to Senior Guy 3 were met with the typical management talk. He sympathizes and badmouths them for burdening the company, that he only tolerates it because the owners are close. Senior Guy 2 starts countering all my remarks and comments on drafting on the emails. Even minor agreement points require discussion. If it was his mistake, then we had a call. If not, he made sure to document it. If I raised a point, I was being rigid. However, if Senior Guy number 2 raised a point, it was suddenly made a commercial sense. This wasn't my first rodeo. I really didn't care about proving a point because I wanted out as soon as possible. Any pushback fights are going on deaf ears, because where I am, labour laws are at best recommendations unless you're unionised. The only option is to leave. I was pissed and tired of being pushed over, but I wondered if it was just me angry at the whole situation and finding faults. I had an opportunity to test my theory, so in one of the contracts that we were drafting, I made some comments and sent them to Senior Guy 2. As expected, he countered with verbal suggestions on the phone, which didn't make sense, obviously. However, because he was a senior, I had to do the song and dance and explain these points. So I arranged for the call, explained to him, and documented this on an email, attributing each verbal recommendation, time of the call, and decisions suggested by him. I then sent this back to him for approval. However, this time I CC'd in my boss, Senior Guy number 3, and asked for his approval and recommendation. Surprisingly, this practice was entirely new to them. Both of them were pissed at me. Senior Guy number 2 and 3 were not happy. Senior Guy number 2 was being questioned for the first time on the email, and Senior Guy number 3 couldn't ignore my email as the head of my department. Unsurprisingly, I got a single line non-answer from Senior Guy number 3, basically asking me to discuss this with Senior Guy number 2, followed by a verbal heated instruction to just do what Senior Guy wants and not bother him. Now I was sure that this wasn't going to work for me in the short or long term, so I resigned and gave my notice period for a month, since I was on probation. Senior Guy number 3 was pissed, because he thought that the notice period was for 3 months, and the sale of the company was expected to close in 1 to 2 months. Cue the 1 month harassment and typical follows in any toxic work environment after you resigned. On the last day, I walked up to Senior Guy number 3's cabin and did the obligatory thank you communication. He basically told me that I am picking a huge fight and that he will see that I never get employed in the industry again. He also told me that he is not going to pay me my full and final settlements and dues and relief letter, a huge deal in India to get your next job. Employers hold off on these as blackmail for troublesome employees. His tone implied that there was very little I could do and that they were basically all senior guys. They had been there and done that, I wasn't the first disgruntled employee for him. I said my goodbyes. I got IT to confirm that I have returned the company's assets and CC'd my personal email. However, I was pissed as well at the whole ordeal and had made my mind up not to show this on my CV. Revenge starts here. I call this a 1-2 shot. Shot 1. Once I left, I spoke with a friend and decided to serve a legal notice detailing the ordeal, and treatment melted out for me. Ordinarily, the legal notice barely makes a difference as the management usually is thick-skinned about it. However, the legal notice was also sent out to the owners, not just the company. This wasn't really required, but I did it anyway. Turns out, many directors were pissed at senior guy number 1, 2, and 3, but were quiet, just waiting to sell the company out. My act of involving the owner means that the entire board, including outside directors, mandatory for listed entities, this turned into a festival of explanations by all three in front of the owner. From what I hear, they all had to take personal leave to meet the owners as shareholders and explain themselves as naughty kids. Needless to say, everyone in the company was talking about it. I waited for 1 month to see if the notice had any effect aside from being chastised like kids. Expectedly, I got no response, but I knew from the grapevine that they now had to spend on a law firm to reply to me because shareholders were aware of this information and I had made my point, but now I wanted more. I really didn't want to drag it because I was also looking for jobs and had loans to pay. However, this template management response, this time with HR copied in, basically implied that since I had left without notice, they were evaluating all options, including considering me AWOL. Senior guy 2 basically threatened me to say that he will not pay me my dues or relief letter evidence serving, and implied that there was very little that I can do about it. Petty that I am, I made plans to get both. Shot 2. Since I had access to the definite agreement and remembered huge details about it, having worked with law firms through the agreement in detail. Number 1. I was aware of who stays/goes. I made sure to speak to the ones who were going to be let go. Queued mass resignations and missed deadlines. Number 2. I knew the specific approvals that would trigger this because of the transaction, so I spoke to the authority who would approve this transaction as a disgruntled employee. The authority made their own inquiry. The owners got spooked. It was definitely not serious enough to scare them into thinking that the deal won't get approved, but the mere fact that the government authority was calling them meant that now they had to deal with the authority, which would have never happened if this wasn't for me. Result number 1. Buyer used this as a low-value bargaining chip, citing bad employee experiences and the resignation of several key members on key projects. Number 2. I got my dues and relieving letter, evidence serving within 48 hours of shot 2. Number 3. Company got gossip for years and about how the management was dumb enough to mess with a lawyer, including a sermon from the owners on how not to piss off their employees when they are trying to sell the company. Number 4. Senior guy number 1 and 2 were left red-faced but survived because of their old ties. However, their contracts were not renewed. Senior guy number 3, who threatened me, became a consultant after the company was sold. Wow. What an amazing 2 stories we read right there, honestly. That's some great revenge. I'm glad he got his money back at the end of it. Anyway, guys, I really hope you guys liked those 2 videos. Curious Cat Stories. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any comments, I'd appreciate it. Take care. Bye.